Oh yes, Larry Buerta here, and you are listening to Fixate on Code, the weekly bite-sized podcast where I talk to the best devs about their favorite strategies for writing great code. Now, let's chat with today's featured guest, John Allsopp. John, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, you're most welcome, Larry.
John has been building for the web since the early 90s with his timeless article, The Dao of Web Design, his book, Developing with Web Standards, and as co-founder of the Web Directions conference series, John has made a massive impact on the lives of designers and developers the world over. John, can you fill in some of the gaps in that intro and tell me a little bit about what you get up to when you're not writing code?
Yeah, it's a hard one. I mean, they just covered about 25 years of my life. And happily or sadly, it may be pretty much covered it all. I came to the web differently to a lot of people, actually from a computer science and software engineering background, unlike, ironically, a lot of people on the web, and we're revisiting that question these days. That's what I studied in the at university in the 80s. And I developed a kind of hypertext knowledge management system in the early 90s. And when I thought about how I was going to distribute this, the web was quite nascent. It was like 93, and I was thinking to myself, we could sell this on the internet. Because at the time, if you wrote software, it was a bit like the music industry. You got a publishing deal, and the publisher basically gave you a small royalty, and you wrote the software, and they looked after everything else, and your destiny was in their hands. So we adopted the web very early, and at the time, to be quite honest, I thought the web was I think it was a bit of a fad in the sense that, so the web is hypertext, right? And I was writing a hypertext system, and it's something, the whole area is something I've been very interested in for a number of years. And most experts in the field of hypertext at the time looked down on the web as being very, lightweight, really not real hypertext. And in fact, so in 1991, the year that Tim Berners-Lee kind of launched the web on the world, there was a big conference called Hypertext 91. It was the big hypertext conference. And you've got to keep in mind, there wasn't just research around hypertext at the time. There was actually a lot of commercial applications available from all the big names. It was a big field already. And Tim Berners-Lee proposed a paper about the World Wide Web, and it was rejected.
Wow.
So the whole research in the hypertext community at the time thought there wasn't anything. And there's a whole list of reasons why people rejected this. I've written about this quite extensively and spoken a bit as well. But interestingly, the very things that people criticize the web for, things like, links were one directional, not bi-directional. They weren't typed. Yeah. So you wouldn't say this link to this is a reference or an annotation or a citation, which is a pointer in the direction. There was no centralized kind of hub that allowed you to see the connections between documents. All of those things were considered state of the art for hypertext. And the web came along and did none of those, right? And very importantly, even one of the criticisms was that, there was no business model, right? It was just free, and people were giving it away. So it turns out, funnily enough, that all the things that people saw as being a weakness of the web really were its strength, and allowed it to propagate and get in the hands of people who weren't software engineers and programmers, and kind of take over the computing landscape by accident in many respects. But, so that was the beginning, and I quickly worked out, actually, there's something to this web thing, and I kind of developed courses, and then I saw, especially when CSS came along, I really saw that there weren't any good tools around that. So I developed CSS tools that I developed for many years, and around that, then realized that the way to get people to know that you've got CSS tools is to develop kind of training and materials. And we did one of the very original kind of bug features of CSS, not unlike Can I Use today, right? So this is going back into the mid-90s. So essentially, I kind of slowly migrated from being this very traditional, in many respects, software engineer who wrote, code that ran on Mac and Windows, to being a person who really came to see the value and the power of the web. And I've spent, I guess, the last 20 years or so focused on that. In more recent years, I guess, this is all about programming and developing. And I do a bit of that still, but it's not like I used to do that all the time. And that's a great love of mine. But increasingly, I guess what I do is I help amplify the voices and ideas of other people through our conferences, through, finding channels for people to get on stage or develop their skills, to publish them and so on. So increasingly, that's my role, I guess. And I still try to keep up with technology, but I certainly don't write a lot of production code every day anymore, sadly.
So, John, what are you most passionate about as a developer?
Yeah, so there's so much in that question, right? So I guess whether or not it's what I'm most passionate about, most interested in. So I have this idea that I call it, I think we've been in this era of computing for the last 40 years, since the mid-70s. You might call it personal computing.
Mm.
And it sort of started with things like the Apple I and these very early personal computers, the Sinclair and so on. And while you might think the era of a kind of iPad or Android, top of the range Android or iPhone device is profoundly different from that era, there are a lot of really strong similarities, of what computing is. So the way we interact with these devices, I think, is particularly interesting, the similarities. So our interactions are largely text-based.
Mm-hmm.
Like, even though, we've been, in the intervening years, we've moved to GUIs and then the touch-based interface, but we still mostly look at text on a screen and we read it and write it. We directly manipulate objects on a screen. We touch a thing, a button or so on. And most importantly, I guess, we use our kind of prefrontal cortex, and we use our visual cortex. It's all using that part of our brain to interact. We also kind of have this very app-centric model, abstraction in our head of what a computer is. It's a bunch of apps, and we go to this app for this feature, and we go to that app to do this task.
Yeah.
And all of those, I guess, are legacies of the last 40 years. What I'm really interested in and excited about are what I see as those breaking down, that paradigm of computing changing. And in the same way that mini computing and mainframe computing prior to those didn't go away. I mean, people's large organizations still spent lots of money on mainframes and lots of money on mini computers. People still program in COBOL, right? This whole paradigm's not going to go away.
Yeah.
But what I think we will do is we will usher in a new paradigm of computing that I think will depend less and less on text and reading and writing. And I guess less and less on intentionality. Like, I think it's got to be less about having a thought and directly manipulating a computer. Because let's face it, computers are pretty dumb, right? They sit there and they wait for us to tap or type or click, right? They don't do anything for us. And yet they have so much power, there's so much capability.
Yeah.
So, to me, there's something, and then around that, this idea of a monolithic application that does kind of one app does everything, right, for us. And it's very much a silo of functionality, right? My photos are over here, and I take them with a camera, and then it's a devil of a time to get them over here to manipulate them in some, Pixelmator or whatever tool I use. And then, like, we have these very disjointed sets of functionality that are actually quite monolithic. Whereas Unix had that kind of idea of piping together these very small pieces of functionality, right? So I think what excites me and what I'm really interested in is to see it, I hope, a transition toward a different paradigm of much less app-centric, monolithic computer functionality and much less intentional interaction with computers, much more kind of contextual, in a sense, computing becoming a kind of augmentation of our existence. Like, I've got this ear pod in my ear, and, you can only imagine Moore's Law a couple of generations means this is very, very small. Or, cochlear implants. We've already got people, tens of hundreds of thousands of people a year getting cochlear implants implanted. When we've got this constant interaction with a computer that can, use a microphone to pick up everything around us, it can be recording everything we talk about and analyzing it, maybe feeding information back to us. Or, John, are you feeling all right today? Picking up the patterns that might, indicate that I, if I, struggle with depression, that maybe an episode is coming on I haven't even realized yet. Look, there are obviously a lot of concerns about the idea of computers just listening to us all the time and recording everything we do. But I think there's something, another level of computing there that will take computing into more and more parts of our life. And I think will augment us. And to me, that's very interesting. And I guess the other part of that is, the technologies we need for this, they're all here and they're not hard to use. If you can program with JavaScript and you can use a web API, well, you can tap into these AI APIs at Amazon Web Services or Watson or Google Cloud Platform. You can tap into the microphone. Like right now, the idea that all of this interaction between you and I on the other sides of the world go directly through a web browser with no need to configure any sort of network between us. So I just visit a URL on the web browser, and now this is this magic sound going between the two of us, literally halfway around the world, and being recorded by a server somewhere else. I think the capabilities of this generation of computing are all there. It's up to us now to imagine what it might be like and really to start building.
Yeah, and people have been talking about AI for 30 or 40 years now, and within the last 10 or so years, it's become reality, and it's pervasive without us even realizing it. And now companies like Google and, I suppose Google's making the biggest noise at the moment about quantum computing. and the capabilities that's going to have, it's going to be an incredible world. And it's interesting to imagine that our direct interaction is actually being decreased while the benefits are going to be massively increased. So that's a really interesting perspective. Now, John, can you tell me about the worst experience you've ever had on a project?
Look, I'm probably quite fortunate. I mean, the one I thought about this, and the sort of thing I've thought about is people just not paying their bills. I think, one time I remember one particular time that really, there was a lot of money and it made a real difference to my life for a bit.
Yeah.
Maybe that's when I finally stopped doing any sort of client work. I'm just trying to think back to when I did a lot of development. You threw out a bunch of code and it took days to recreate, or really pernicious bugs that you sort of took forever to chase down. And when you did, I remember one time it was a setting that I changed in a compiler like months, if not years before. And I ran into this brick wall, and I just got, at this point, this whole code base is wrong. I don't know where to start. I've looked at everything. It was working fine in the kind of developer tools, but as soon as I compiled and ran it, and compile times were like hours, I build overnight.
Yeah.
And you're like, literally every time you couldn't spot the error, and you thought, you build it overnight, get up the next morning, and then for some reason this idea, there's something. I think it was in the system. So in the Mac, when you used to program the Mac before Mac OS 10, you would have these resources, right, where you'd have all your icons and your strings, and you'd also set things like flags for how memory was allocated and deallocated, like blocks of memory. And I must have set something months before. It all worked for months and months, and then stopped happening. And I, that's the one that comes to mind. I guess, I spent several days, and I really got to the point. I thought this whole code base is somehow ruined, and I have no idea how to fix it. I'm sure we all have experiences like that.
What was your biggest takeaway from having gone through that?
Yeah, I think it was more than anything that debugging is a black art, and I debugged a lot by that time. But we sort of you would have this strategy. You have these strategies of debugging. A binary tree effectively. Well, if I look at this half the code base, and if it works, then it must be the other half. There's a point you get to where you run out all your tricks, and it's just something strange up in the back of your mind about what you might have done and so on. So there you go.
Connecting the dots.
Yes, it is, and that's the sort of thing. I guess we as developers, we kind of we bury away all the work that we've done on a project, and there's that time where something tweaks and remember that thing over here. Anyway, I think we've all had that experience. There you go. That was the best I could come up with. I guess that's good, really. It wasn't like something blew up or somebody sent an accidental alert about missiles incoming or something. There are far worse things could happen, right?
How many times does a semicolon throw you off for hours, and it turns out to be the biggest problem?
Well, I remember when I was doing computer science in the 80s, and we studied Fortran, which most people probably never heard of, but it was at the time, or certainly when it was invented some decades before, it had been quite a high level language. But the story, whether or not apocryphal story, was that one of the early Mercury pre-manned missions kind of blew up, or something terrible happened, and it was because of a semicolon as opposed to a colon that was used in the language, and one of them was a terminator, and one of them was a looping enumerator or something. I can't exactly remember, but and yet we still seem to produce languages that are very similar in lots of ways to those languages. They're based syntactically and so on in a lot of ways on those languages from like Algol and so on from 50 or 60 years ago.
All right, John. Now, in terms of getting quality work done on a daily basis, which method or tool do you use that you'd hate to be without?
I am, and I don't do this all the time, right? But I do find when I make a list of things that I have to do, and I kind of like start the day by sitting down and look at, what are the things I have to do today, and work out a flow that maybe, even if I allocate, well, this is not that important, I'll do it right now, I'll do it a couple out of the way. And this one here, it's a bit of a pain, but I'll do it over lunch because I don't really, but these ones are really important. So I try to allocate the tasks that I have so that I kind of maximize for my, I know that I'm more productive at certain times of the day than others. And I know at certain times of the day, it's nice just to tick a few things off the box. So I find in some ways, some approach, and I've tried all the various formal getting things done and all these different techniques, but I and I think they all have their merits, but what I find now is I just sort of, today I'm going to do this, and it's okay if I don't do all these things unless there's there's something that has to be done, and then tomorrow I'll pretty much start by saying, right, okay, what didn't I do yesterday, line them up and get the other things. And I find that kind of keeps me really honest, and at the end of the day you can look back and think, what did I do today, right? There's a kind of, that whole thing, people who show gratitude tend to be happier. right? So often there's this meditative practice or mindfulness practice where at the end of the day, you can think of, often they say 3, but I think one thing you're grateful for today, you're thankful that happened. And this is what I try to do with my kids at dinner time, right? Sit down with the kids, okay, tell me something you're grateful for today. So it just becomes this ritual, just one thing. So at the end of the day, you can kind of have this thing where you look back, and I'm literally looking at the paper now, and I'm seeing this line through. There was like 25 items, and I've got through about 20 of them, and lines through them, and it gives me a sense of accomplishment and progression. And there are certainly some days where we really need that more than others. So it helps in 2 ways. It helps me kind of, I think, use my time best. It helps me think in advance about what I'm going to do with my time today. And at the end of the day, it gives me that benefit of looking back and thinking, no, I got some things done, right? Like I didn't just, because those days where you feel like, God, I've been running around since 7:30 this morning. I don't feel I've done anything, right? Yeah. What did I do? Well, I can literally glance down and see all the things. And oh my God, I got to do that blog post tomorrow. So as well. So that's the first thing tomorrow, doing a blog post.
So where in your daily work do you still get frustrated, and where do you feel there's room for things to be done in a more effective way?
Everywhere. For both of those. So one thing has sort of happened in my life, right? So as a developer for many years, I wrote the software. There's a couple of us really. I wrote the software. We did all the marketing and the documentation and everything around it together. And about even 15 years ago, or certainly 13 or 14 years ago, that transition from being what I did primarily to increasingly running events. It took me a long time to sort of really identify as someone who ran an event. Like, this is what I did, right? And so when I shifted from, I write code and then organize the events on the side. So, like the code stuff's great, but the primary thing that I need to focus on it because it generates the revenue and everything is these events. So I guess for me, I spent like 15 to 20 professional years developing kind of knowledge in a number of languages and tool sets and platforms and frameworks and get really good at those. And then in a way had to start all over again. And I still feel like, having devoted an awful lot of time, like probably the last decade, really most of my time to running these events, I still only feel like I'm beginning to understand the whole of the business and the areas where I can improve. And so, my frustration, I guess, is because I had a lot of competency in one area, you just naturally, I just think it's a human thing, right? I'm competent, right? And so I guess what frustrates me is I maybe don't stop and think, what, maybe it's a better way of doing this. And maybe I could go and do some research because I'm sure someone solved this problem before, right? So it's something I have no problem doing when I'm programming. Like recently I built something that was relatively sophisticated using the audio API and then a whole bunch of stuff. Really, it was an interesting project. So all this technology I knew really well, I found myself Googling everything. Right. And yet someone who, has developed professionally for 20 plus years, I didn't feel any shame or, that was in no way problematic for me to do that. And yet I don't translate that into the way I kind of run my business and think about cash flow and think about marketing strategies. I don't know what that's about, and maybe this is a wake-up call. But so what I need to, I guess, do is find 2 or 3 of these real pain points and use an approach that I would unhesitatingly use if I was starting a new programming language or framework or something like that.
So John, in terms of new projects, libraries, or frameworks, what are you most excited about? Do you have an opportunity to work with new libraries with all the conference organizing that you do?
No. I mean, when I come to build things, I generally rely on what I know really well already. And usually it's a bit of a proof of concept to get someone else maybe to say, hey, we've got this thing, do you want to finish this and build it out? But so to translate into what I do, recently, and this, maybe I'm a terrible sellout at this point, but we have this database of all these people who have attended our conference, like thousands of people over here. And then we were doing email campaigns through this particular tool, and we've been doing that for years. And recently, and we've been exploring these different tool sets, bringing all these together and being able to kind of see, if we send this campaign out, who's responded, where are they coming, all that kind of programmatic stuff that anybody who's been doing this stuff for a while knows backwards, right? And we've had a couple of goes at it, and it hasn't quite stuck. And in recent weeks, it really has. And it's actually genuinely exciting me to think, okay, now that we have more insight into our customers, how can we use that I'm very customer focused. Like I feel it's not about how can we trick them into doing something we want them to do, but rather how can we use these insights? What are they following? When we do our newsletter, what links are they following, right? And how can that help us, travel in that direction? So I guess it's an analytical approach to a very different sort of problem. But it's really, I guess it's an example of what frustrations and efficiencies are there that I could have. I guess it's an example of that. But it's also, I guess, it speaks to that kind of bringing a mindset from one area that I have expertise and trying to apply it in other areas. It's taking me far too long to do it. But yes, I'm genuinely excited about how I can get better insights into our customers to sort of tailor things better for them, training and other resources that we develop.
Now, John, which specific aspects about programming has dramatically changed the way that you think about and write code?
Yeah, so I started programming like a lot of people of my generation. You picked up a language like BASIC, and you probably had some sort of pre-PC style computer at home. I had a TRS-80, which kind of is far older than most of the listeners, I'm sure. And its user interface was BASIC, right? Like literally not BASIC, as it was literally capital B, capital A, capital SIC, BASIC. You typed BASIC into it to interact with it, right? And it had a tape deck where you literally audio cassettes that recorded in analog, converted digital analog to have your programs, right? And it was very imperative, very traditional imperative language, right? Like it had line numbers and go-tos and all business, right? Mm-hmm. And then when I went to university, we learned Pascal. It wasn't really toward the end of university, object-oriented programming became a thing, right? So in that late 80s. And so I spent kind of 20-odd years being in that imperative paradigm of very traditional programming language using object-oriented programming. And then I came to the web, and with HTML, but then in particular with CSS, that whole declarative approach to programming, which a lot of people still deride is not really programming, right? Mm-hmm. But that idea of declaring what you want to happen rather than saying how you want it to happen was to me probably the great revelatory kind of approach to change in programming. And as someone who shipped serious amounts of code on multiple platforms, mainframes, minis, Macs and Windows. When I hear people talk about kind of the web as being a bit of a toy, or CSS and HTML aren't really programming and all that kind of stuff, I was like, I think people are closing themselves off to an extraordinary power of the platform. And I think at the moment we're seeing that a bit we really undervalue CSS. I think, people want to try and get CSS in JavaScript, or they just want to use JavaScript in place of CSS. And I think a lot of it, we obviously it's not, if you've got your experienced React developer, you can get lots of great jobs. If you're a really, really good CSS developer, you might have a lot of trouble, getting as many job kind of, offers and so on. And I think it's a real shame because I feel like the foundations of the web and the DOM and HTML and CSS are still incredibly powerful. And I think one of the challenges is that there are a different way of thinking about development. And if JavaScript is really to that traditional imperative approach to programming. This is what I want to happen, right? This is how I want it to happen. And I think no matter how proficient people are in JavaScript, I actually feel that they would get tremendous value out of learning a bit more about CSS. Because, I don't know how many times people have been doing things with JavaScript for years and they're really good at it. And you point out that, well, hey, CSS does it like this. Like, what? Like, I don't have to do all this complex, rickety stuff with all these exceptions. It's just, you just say, I want this to happen, right? And I think things like, Flexbox and Grid and some of those really complex kind of layout tools that we now get, hopefully will wake up a lot of developers to the power and sophistication of CSS. But again, you have to approach it, you have to think differently. It's a declarative approach. Like you have to, and I think that to me, that shift in thinking was pretty profound. And if other people are looking to really empower themselves around the web, that's what I would look to try and do to understand CSS and HTML in those terms.
And not take it for granted because they're super powerful technologies. And with that, we've come to the end of our first segment. John, I'm about to throw some quickfire questions your way. Let's do this. What is the best advice about programming that you have ever received?
You ain't going to need it. So it's an expression at YAGNI, Y-A-G-N-I. You ain't going to need it. So if you don't need it, don't build it, right? I think it's a pretty good software engineering principle from way back. And there's a whole bunch of them. I really recommend people look at software engineering going back 50, 60 years because we learn a lot over the last 50, 60 years. And I sometimes think we've forgotten those lessons.
Yeah, and making the same mistakes over and over again.
Absolutely. Each generation, right?
John, which personal habits do you attribute to writing better code?
Yeah, so I think I have this strange mixture of OCD and ADHD, and neither are officially recognized. But I think I have aspects of each of them. They're all continuums, right? And I think I can do both at times. Like I can find times where I can really drill down on the details and get the details right, which you have to when you've got 8-hour build times, and if it doesn't work, you've got to start again tomorrow. But at the same time, writing really good software, I think, is about making those disparate connections, even going back to that memory of that thing that I'd done 9 months ago in this weird settings part of my build tools that I thought, could that in some way be related to this? So I think there's a combination of this sort of, attention to detail. Like, it's not an attention, it's kind of a fixation on detail at times, coupled with the capacity to sort of roam across an area, with that less focused approach.
If you could recommend one book on programming, what would it be and why?
That's a really hard one. Because I guess, there's these classics people refer to, like Muth and Dijkstra's, software engineering and things like that. There's the Gang of Four and the patterns and all those sorts of things. I don't have an answer, I'm afraid, for a single one. I mean, I think some really good, like Axel Rauschmeyer's books on JavaScript and Kyle Simpson's books on JavaScript, especially up to date now, are really, really valuable. But maybe there's value going back to Jeff Zellman's Designing with Web Standards. It's a classic, and it goes back to some of the really fundamental principles of building for the web. And while probably people won't necessarily learn specific techniques or anything that's maybe specifically applicable today, I think it would give an understanding of an approach to the web that has served us well for, at least 15, if not 20 years. So perhaps I'll go with that. I'll go with Jeff's Designing with Web Standards.
Who in the front-end world is doing work that's really inspiring?
See, once upon a time, not that long ago, not even like maybe more than about less than 15 years ago, you kind of knew all the people doing everything, right? Certainly the ones who published and wrote, and no one spoke at conferences. That just really didn't happen until not much more than about a decade ago. And everyone did everything. You had to know everything about what you did, right? You probably specialized in something. Now it's so really fragmented. It's hard to say. And one person who's really impressed me recently is Jason Miller, who does Preact. So Preact is a very, very lightweight, API compatible, it's like 4 kilobytes compressed or something ridiculous version of React. Like Jason, we had a fortunate thing coming out and speaking at a conference last year, and kind of has a very thoughtful way of thinking about the technologies and how to communicate them as well. So, Jason right now is a mixture of someone who is developing really interesting technology, and also is very articulate in talking about not just his own technology, but the web platform as a whole. So he definitely one I say people should check out.
Now, John, imagine you wake up and you have no recollection of ever having written code. With your knowledge of the tools, books, and courses available today, how would you go about learning from scratch?
It's probably a really bad answer, given what I said about learning a whole new set of skills around, conference planning and so on. I have found the only way I happen to be able to really learn something is to pick a genuine real-world problem and learn a technology as I solve that problem, rather than doing little it's maybe as a foible of mine, sitting down and working through exercises. I find it occasionally if I can't grok a particular thing, that might be valuable. But on the whole, what I've found to learn something with any depth is to actually think, what is a real world thing I can build with this and build it, right? And from the very first time I learned the first language I used commercially, that's essentially, I had an idea of what I wanted to build. I thought this is the right technology, but I didn't know the technology particularly well. And I used, once I familiarized myself with the basic, I just said, right, I'm going to build this thing. And I did. Whether or not that thing should be deployed on the world, I'm not entirely sure. But that's the approach and because what I generally think you find is you stumble across, or you come across the common patterns that you'll need time and again. Like I remember listening to Tim Ferriss once. I think he has his strengths and his weaknesses. Kind of has this approach to this 80-20 approach to things like learning languages, right? He talks about, say, learning Japanese, which he did when he was younger. And so basically there might be a couple of hundred phrases and a few hundred words that will account for about 80% of all language you use. So rather than going at the beginning and learning, just if you acquire that core set of techniques that allows you to take the first step out into the street in Japan, where you're going to learn, right? And bootstrap from there. And that applies, I think, in terms of programming. What do I need to do? Well, I learned the first thing I need to do, whether it's, set up my build environment or whatever. Like at each step, I'm learning things, and surely my logic kind of is the first things you're going to learn, the things that you come back to time and again, are the things that are going to be very common over time, right? So that would probably be my approach if I ever had the opportunity to learn something from scratch again, which I increasingly think I'm not going to be able to do, but never know.
And John, let's wrap up with your top tip on how to work smart and the best way to connect with you.
So how do you work smart? I don't know. Like I developed this really bad habit in high school of working to the clock in terms of like I had to do a certain number of hours of study. And I think it served me really well at school. But then when you're in university, when your workloads are much higher, like I found it didn't work very smart, right? So I think it's very much the 80-20 rule. Like what are the 20% of things that are going to get you 80% of the results? Because you'll get a long way. And then at that point, given, increasingly we realize that we've got to be iterative with everything we do, we've invested 20% of our effort to get a long way. And if we realize we haven't gone the right direction, well, we haven't spent all that 80% of the effort, right? So I think something along those lines. And how you can get me, well, probably the best thing is I'm John Allsopp on Twitter, or just about anywhere. So that's John with an H and Allsopp with 2 L's and 2 P's. So I'm on Twitter. Come say hi. I'm here strange hours, all day and night, basically. So come say hi.
To everyone out there, you've been hanging with John Allsopp and Larry Buerter. Head over to fixate.it where you'll find links and timestamps for everything we've been chatting about today. And John, thank you for sharing your journey with Fixate on Code. Keep pushing the limits and keep pushing great code.
Thanks, mate. I had a great time.